Dry beans. Not something that a lot of people necessarily think about growing. The big question, is it worth it? And hopefully as we go through this video, we'll answer that question. We are out in the garden again, and Rooster, it's time for another Seed Saving 101 video. And this time, we're actually going to talk about one of, I guess my favorites, and something that really, pardon the pun, grown on us over the years, and that's beans. These are, in particular, our Ireland Creek Annie beans, which have a bit of a story behind them, because I actually received these in a mixed pack of dried beans, and it was labeled with what the varieties were, and I only received one seed, and that's like 12 or 13 years ago. And from that one seed, we've grown countless Ireland Creek Annies, and we're about to do the same this year. We're going to talk about the beans and some things to consider when you're planning to save seeds from beans. Well, not completely done. I still got to cover the one row, but I have two, I don't know, fairly lengthy rows of Ireland Creek Annie here. Ireland Creek Annie bean is a bush bean with a bush growth habit. It will grab on a little bit and sometimes needs a little bit of support, but it is basically a member of the common bean species. For this video, I'm basically going to stick to what people often think of as more or less beans. The common bean is actually native to the Americas. It is by far and large the most common bean that's been diversified into quite an array of different varieties. Hence the name common bean. Beans are interesting because they do have complete flowers, but generally speaking, common bean flowers aren't particularly attractive to a lot of insects. And this is where it gets a little bit funny. So like a lot of other seed saving videos in this series, and just sort of the general concepts in seed saving, a lot of it has to do with this notion of isolation. Now, timing is a little harder with beans because, depending on where you live, I should say, because for us, the common bean is a heat-loving plant, so we pretty much have kind of one shot at it. So you really are stuck with that isolation. The minimum separation distance is 3 to 6 meters. The gold standard is about 50 meters, and there's a reason for this. Although they have beautiful flowers, they're not particularly attractive to insects. So if you have other more attractive flowering plants in or near your garden, a lot of the pollinators will completely ignore your common beans and some of the other members of the bean family as well. Now the plus side to this is these species are self-fertile, so they don't need the pollination. But that's the one tricky bit. That's sort of the scientific method, but when you put this in perspective and you think over time, there are so many different varieties of common bean that have been developed. They essentially developed through isolation and selection because they don't cross super well. So although keeping the minimum of the 3 meters, you may not eliminate it. The chances are, if you've got anything that's more attractive, you're not going to get crossing. So for an example, by the time that these beans go to flower, these squash will be in full bloom, and they're far more attractive. Now, I wouldn't bank on just a couple of squash, but as I say, as long as there's other things that the pollinators like, you're probably good to go. If you're in an area where you have nothing but beans, you're probably going to get crossing. We are under our trellis of Bama's beans, which are a pole bean type bean. So these are actually a common bean, but as you can see here, we have quite a few pods. I mean, this is just one little cluster. They've gone dry and crunchy. So that means the beans inside are essentially dry beans. So we're going to go through and pick this variety and another one and kind of discuss, I guess, our thoughts on growing dry beans. Well, I've gone through and basically picked what is ready for harvesting as dry beans from these Bama's beans already. Now, one thing I will say about dry beans is they're generally basically the same as when you're picking the fresh eating beans in that they're not all ready at the exact same time. So you usually do have to come back with multiple harvests. That does depend on the variety. These are a pole bean type bean, so they definitely have kind of an extended period of production of both the green beans but also their dried pods. As you can see, you end up with quite a bit off the plants, because let's face it, this is what the plant's trying to do, is reproduce and propagate itself. So what we'll end up doing is we're going to take these in the house in a few minutes, and we'll probably leave them a little bit longer because it's a little drier in the house, because as you can kind of tell, it's a bit overcast. We're trying to pick some of these before, in case it rains, because that'll set back your ability to collect. Now, that's a negative to dry beans, is you do sometimes, depending on where you live in the world, you may be fighting the weather, i.e. we're September, these are just starting to come into, this is our first harvest of dry beans off these plants, and these pods are just at that sort of ready stage. You don't want to leave it until the rainy seasons come, because your pods and the beans inside them will mold on you. And sometimes when it comes to bush beans, which is difficult to do with pole beans, but with bush beans, if you get to that point that they're not quite ready, you can actually pull the whole plant up and hang it somewhere to allow them to dry a little bit further. But you definitely want to do this, as picking the pods, you want to do it when they're dry. These pods here, as you can see, are like, I can squeeze them. They're definitely well past the green eating stage. There's not too many on here that are still at that stage, but they haven't dried enough, and you can actually feel, at least with this variety, you can kind of feel in there that the bean is still basically moist. It hasn't dried. This one, you can hear it's a little crinklier, but there's still some rubberiness to it. And obviously, like here in the background, this would be a bean that's gone past its sort of edible state as a pod, but still has quite a long time to go. So if I kind of back up here a little bit, like I say, you can see you'll get quite the variation in state of ripeness when you go to collect your dry beans. So now we're in front of what really doesn't look very impressive here. These are our Ireland Creek Annie beans, and as you can see, most of these plants have completely died back, like completely died back, and you're pretty much left with just the dried pods. So these are prime for harvesting. They haven't dried to the point of splitting. And as you can see here, I don't know if you can hear it, but they're quite crunchy, and the beans inside are quite firm. So we're going to go ahead and essentially walk down this double row and try to harvest as much as we can off these. There's a few I see that are not quite ready, but we'll probably leave them. But this is a bush bean, and this is the other kind of growth habit of the plant, I suppose would be the best way to put it, that you can grow to get dry beans. And a lot of bush beans are quite useful as dry beans. This particular variety is kind of they're a brownish, yellowish colored bean that's very good, just like a thickener. Now, this particular variety, again, is not necessarily dual purpose. We find that the pods they're edible in the green state, but we basically grow this primarily for the dry bean product. We find these yield enough usually, and this year we're not sure because, as you can see, it kind of became a bit of a jungle, but they usually yield enough to get a decent amount from a patch of them, so hence why they've stayed for so many years. So because these plants, these Ireland Creek Annie plants, are essentially so far gone, I mean, there's a little bit of life in them, but we're just ripping the whole plant out because that actually makes it really easy to harvest. This particular, as I just said about the pole beans, with a lot of bean varieties, they're not all ready at exactly the same time, but with these dry beans, because you're not picking green beans off them, the plant generally sets the amount of seeds that it wants to set, put it that way, and that's kind of it. So when you're growing a bush bean, for example, that's just for dry beans, they do tend to be more or less ready at the same time, although you will get the odd one that's maybe not. This is not a great representation of how prolific this particular variety, or even dry beans in general, can be, because they essentially got set back early on this year and they never really recovered. So we're pretty happy with the results here, and we're treating this a bit as a year of saving seeds with mostly the intent of using them to replant. So I'm in another garden now, and I just wanted to quickly show another kind of dry bean that we grow, which is actually known to be a dual purpose, i.e. very good for fresh eating as a green bean, but also exceptional for a dry bean. And we're not going to harvest this one today, but just wanted to give you a sneak peek. And this particular variety is probably performing a little bit more as what you would expect from a dry bush bean than our Ireland Creek Annies did. So these beans, which are again a little bit overgrown, but not terribly, are our black Valentine beans. This variety is a green bean, as you can see on some of those pods that are just starting to turn yellow to their dry state, but it's also an excellent black bean variety. You get a dual purpose out of it. Now, unlike the pole beans, on a bush bean, if you're going to try to get both products out of the plant, you're better off to sort of allocate the plants that you want for dry beans. Essentially, you don't want to wait, you don't want to keep picking green beans off the plant until late in the fall and then hope that you're still going to get a dry bean crop. That being said, they're usually very prolific, a lot of these bush beans, so you only usually need to allocate a small section. We had kind of planned, like, you know, one of these little panels worth, and it just didn't happen. So we're going to get a really good, I anticipate we're going to get a really good harvest off of these. So that's kind of the outdoor discussion, given the time of year, on dry beans, the harvesting part. One of the nice things, before we take things in the house, about these dry beans is, outside of the getting them physically harvested out of the garden, they're extremely forgiving. This is a crop that, as long as you get it in when it's dry, hence dry beans, and keep it dry in the house, you don't have to process these immediately. In fact, you can wait months. If you needed to, you could probably wait years, as long as they were kept dry in a warmish, dry location. We often don't do our full processing because we do it by hand for the most part. We often don't fully process everything until well into the winter, when sort of time allows, and they'll often stay in their containers, as they say, in a dry location for months before we get around to them. So this is another extremely forgiving. Well, it's a few days later, and we're back in the house, and in typical we've just hit fall fashion, we've got some cooler and wet weather, which for dry beans is never really the best, because they need that heat to really dry out and be, well, dry beans. But fortunately, we managed to get almost all of our dry beans harvested. We still have two kinds left, but they were a little further behind, so we're hoping that they will both do all right. But I will take you and show you kind of what we ended up with. So here's kind of the harvest. Now you can see this has basically not been completely processed, and that's one of the wonderful things about dry beans, is provided, I think I've already mentioned this, but if they come in the house in the pod dry, you don't have to harvest them right away. This can be a winter project for all that matters. You just have to keep them somewhere dry. But basically here we've got 2 boxes of our black Valentine beans, and you can see in here too, these are quite dry. So those will probably stay in the boxes for a while, because we're kind of at busy season right now, so it'll be a surprise a little later to see how much we actually get as far as the dry beans go. And then we got a pretty good sized box full of Bama's pole beans as well. For illustrative purposes, I did take and sort of shell all of our Ireland Creek Annie beans. Now this was the bean that we didn't get as good of a harvest as we were hoping for, but this will more than give a seed to plant next year. I mean, I think this, I weighed it, it was 550 grams or something like that. Not a bad haul in my opinion. What we're going to do with this is, these are fresher, so most of these will probably get stored until next year. And we tend to, I guess it's the prepping side of things, but we tend to rotate out our stores. So we have some older Ireland Creek Annie beans and some of our other beans that we've kind of held on to, and we'll probably rotate some of them out, cook them, and so forth. So it's nice to have these sort of fresher beans. So that's kind of our I guess, introduction to dry beans. It's something that a lot of people don't ever think about growing, but historically they were very valuable because they're high in protein, they're relatively easy to grow, they don't take a lot of effort. I mean, the bigger patch you get, the more effort it is, but you're getting quite a bit of nutritional value for the effort, I guess would be the best way to put it. As you've seen from out in the garden, there's so many varieties, so many. It's limitless, and there's basically a dry bean that will suit almost every growing condition that at least North America has to throw at you. So I guess in closing, this is just kind of an introduction to something that we have done for quite a few years. It's not glamorous. It's not ultra weight heavy or anything like that, but it is a valuable addition to the garden. And when you have other crops, such as our tomatoes, it's nice to have that staggered crop rotation. So dry beans are an excellent thing to fit in those spaces and help you with your rotation. So next year, when you're planting your gardens, I would strongly recommend considering some dry bean varieties or some dual-purpose varieties that will give you an edible pod bean and a dry bean, and just experiment with it, see how it goes.